Welcome to the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom's Jacob's Ladder. Today we have a massive guest, a great honor of mine to bring on international best-selling author Neale Donald Walsch. You may be familiar with him as the author of Conversations with God. He's also authored 40 other books, including a book that we'll discuss, his latest release, GodTalk. But it's my great honor to bring on Neale. He's been highly influential in my life, and not sure if I would be doing the work that I would be doing without his work, as it was so pivotal in my influence. For those of you who are new to my channel, we love having you on. Make sure you check it out and hit that subscribe button so you can be up to date for more great interviews like this. And those of you who have been on my channel, we love having you back. We take a lot of hard work to all these interviews, so all of your participation helps with these interviews, as our goal is really to elevate the consciousness of the planet and to reach as many souls as we can. But with that, I am so excited to welcome Neale Donald Walsch on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. Neale Donald Walsch, it is a literal lifetime honor to have you on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Within my intro, and I know in our discussions, I've really emphasized that I would not be doing the work that I'm doing today without your influence on my life. And we'll get to some of the specifics. Uh, but I am humbly honored to be in your presence, and I can't tell you the impact that you've had on my life and millions of others around the globe.
Well, gosh, Jacob, those are nice words to say to me, and I appreciate your saying those things. It's lovely to be here with you. I want to make sure that everyone understands that I don't see myself as extraordinary or special in any way. I think we're all special, but I'm not any more special than anybody else.
Mm.
I simply had an experience that everyone in the world is having. We're all having conversations with God all the time. We're simply calling it something else. Some people call it women's intuition. Some people call it an epiphany. Some people call it, a psychic hit, a sudden insight. But all of us are having the same experience all the time. All I did was take a few notes and write down, what I was hearing and what I was receiving. But while I appreciate those very kind words at the introduction, I don't want anyone to think that I'm anything unusual or special. I'm just a guy, a regular person, and I wrote a couple of books, and apparently a few people found them interesting, so they sold a few copies. Fair enough, but beyond that, Jacob, you and I are one human being.
Yes, except I don't have your beautiful voice. That is something spectacular. If there's someone to narrate my life, I would ask for your voice is incredible. So I will say that. Now for my viewers, they who may not have heard, I know you mentioned that you were able to take dictation, from God. If you don't mind, could you share how that happened to you? What was transpiring in your life that led you to that point? And what was this transformation that you had in your life for viewers? Because I'm sure they could take a lot from your profound transformation in your personal life and your relationship with God.
I'd be happy to, Jacob. I went through what I call the triple whammy. I had a relationship with my lovely former spouse. We're still very good friends, but we simply couldn't make it work together in a marriage, so we agreed to end our relationship. And I was, I had to depart from my children. I had visitation rights, but
Mm.
I couldn't see them every day. So it was kind of a very sad moment in my life. But believe it or not, 5 days later, I lost my job. And I wasn't fired. I was kind of like downsized. The corporation said that they had to reduce some overhead, and I was the last person in. And so my boss explained to me, it's not about your performance, but you have no seniority. Last person in, first person out. We have to ask you to leave. So now in the same 5 day period, I'm losing my relationship and losing my job. But wait, the world wasn't done with me yet. 5 days after that,
Mm.
I'm driving to an interview for a new job, which I thought I would surely get because I had all the right qualifications. And an elderly gentleman turned his car, made a left turn right in front of me as I
Mm.
was traveling in the right lane. down the roadway, and he totaled my car. It wasn't a fender bender. He totaled my car, and of course, since he was turning left into my car, he smashed right into the driver's side, and I was pretty shaken up. In fact, I had a broken neck.
Mm.
So the accident broke my neck, and when I got to the hospital, they took me in and did what they had to do to get me out of pain. But when I woke up from the anesthesia, the doctor said, we need to tell you that you didn't have a hairline fracture. You don't have just a little crack in your neck. You've got a 3/4 inch avulsion fracture of the 7 cervical vertebrae posteriorly.
Wow.
In other words, it's a break in your neck big enough to put a pencil through.
Hmm.
And he looked at me and he said, most people who have that kind of a break in their neck die instantly because of spinal cord complications. And if they don't die, the 1 out of 10 that maybe not die, they'll wind up paralyzed from the neck down. You have suffered neither consequence. You're both living and you're not paralyzed. So he looked at me and he said, what do you intend to do with the rest of your life? You've been given a gift that rarely, rarely, rarely occurs in my experience. So I really took that in. I mean, I was shocked, and I had to wear a brace on my neck for the next year and a half. And I was in physical therapy for months and months and months, obviously, but at least I wasn't paralyzed. But the problem with wearing a brace on your neck was, and one of those, they call it a Philadelphia collar, is that nobody would give me a job. Finally, I must have gone to, I'm not exaggerating, probably 15 or 17 interviews. Finally, the last guy I went to said, Mr. Walsch, let me just give it to you straight. Nobody's going to hire you as long as you're wearing that therapeutic device on your neck, because we realize one wrong move on the job, and we're paying your medical bills for the next 5 years. We come in here when you've lost that collar, and we'd hire you in a minute because you got all the qualifications. So then I realized, terrific. Meanwhile, I had lived on the street for a year. You should know that. I ran out of money.
This is in Ashland, Oregon?
Yeah. I was living on the street in Ashland, in and around Ashland, Oregon, and Jackson Hot Springs and so forth, just outside of town, and sleeping on the concrete and asking people for a dime or a dollar to help me get through the day.
Wow.
And that went on for a year, not for two or three bad months, but for a year of my life. So I finally got a weekend job at a local radio station, and I was in broadcasting at the time when I was downsized. Thank you very much. So I wound up getting a weekend job as a weekend fill-in at a large radio station. They gave their announcers the weekend off, Friday and Saturday. They needed somebody to come in and fill in. That's what I did. I didn't make a lot of money, but I did make just enough to afford a one-room studio above somebody's garage. It didn't even have a separate bedroom, but it was, hey, I was out of the weather, and it had its own bathroom, and, I had a little kitchenette, so I was happy. But I woke up one morning. This is a long answer to your short question. I'm sorry. But I woke up one morning at 4:23 in the morning after being in that little studio apartment for about 2 or 3 months. And I was just so furious. And I went out to the couch. I went out. There was one room. I went across the room to the couch where there was a coffee table and a little yellow legal pad that I was using to take notes on stuff. And I wrote a very angry letter to God. Dear God, what does it take to make life work? I mean, what have I done so horrible to deserve a life of such endless struggle? Relationship, lose my job, break my neck in a car accident. Come on, give me a break here. And I'm writing this angry letter.
Yeah.
And I said, tell me the rules. And I remember writing, tell me the rules. I'll play the game. Just give me the damn rules. Don't change them once you give them to me, because my experience had been that the rules of life were changing every 5 minutes. And then I heard a voice, Jacob. At first, I thought it was really in the room. I thought there was somebody behind me. I turned around, of course, there's nobody there. Then I think, oh, great. Now, on top of everything else, I'm losing my mind, hallucinating. But in fact, the voice was very present inside my mind. Very kind, gentle voice that simply said, Neale, do you really want answers to all of these questions? or are you just venting? Because
mm,
I can recall writing down, I am venting, you think,
mm,
but if you've got answers, I'd sure as hell like to know what they are. And God said, you are sure as hell about a lot of things, but wouldn't you rather be sure as heaven?
mm.
And I'm
Wow.
writing down, okay, what's that supposed to mean? I'm having this dialogue with myself, I thought. And then God answered every question I ever asked and
Mm,
inspired me to ask questions I never dreamt of. And I wound up finding myself engaged in a two-way dialogue with what I decided must be the highest place within all of us that I call God. I believe that divinity resides within every sentient being in the cosmos. And so I'm having this ongoing conversation, and not too deeply into it. I mean, not like at the end of it, but somewhere about one quarter of the way through what ultimately became book one. I was told, you will make of this one day a book, and you will
mm,
cause it to be accessed by many people. Now, Jacob, you got to understand, I'm sitting here having this conversation with who I assume to be God, God
mm,
in all of us. And I'm thinking to myself, this is probably my imagination. I mean, so, I said, now I got you. Now I got you. It's the first thing that he said to me that was predictive, that predicted the future. She said,
mm,
you're going to make it a book and it will be accessed by many people. I thought, not going to happen.
mm,
Number one, nobody's going to publish a book by a guy who says, I'm talking to God. I mean, I could
mm,
just see the publisher walking out to the workroom floor and saying to his editors, hold the presses, stop everything. I got a guy here who's talking to God. It's not going to happen.
mm.
It's not going to happen. But in fact, I sent it to a publisher, a small publisher on the East Coast of the United States.
Hampton Roads, is
Yep.
it? Or,
In those days, Hampton Roads. And they put the book out. And I thought, wow, I can't believe it. You're going to actually publish this. Yeah.
mm,
Of course, they didn't give me an advance. Nobody gives an advance to a first-time publisher. I mean, a
mm,
first-time author. But they say, we'll put it out and see what happens.
mm,
I thought, it's not going to sell 500 copies. Nobody's going to buy a book by a guy who claims to be talking to God. And I was
right.
right, by the way. I was
Mm,
totally right. It didn't sell 500 copies. It sold 5 million
wow.
in 37 languages.
Mm,
Wound up being translated into 37 languages.
mm,
So now I'm getting invitations. Of course, Hampton Roads ultimately sold the book to the Putnam Publishing Company in New York, which approached Hampton Roads. They saw the sales.
wow.
Of course, the large publishers track the sales of the small publishers, and they were tracking the sales of this book. And so they called Hampton Roads and said, "We'd like to buy the book from you." They bought the book from Hampton Roads for more money than God has. I mean,
Mm,
millions. And they bought the book from Hampton Roads, and then they published. Then they called me and said, "Do you have any sisters like this at home?"
do,
So
yeah.
I said, "Well, I've continued to have the experience. Experience hasn't stopped." They said, "Send us all that you can."
Mm,
I said, "Really? You want more of this?" I said, "Yeah."
mm.
So they wound up putting out what became book two and book three of Conversations with God.
I have it right over here. The entire series, book one, book two, and book three, was gifted to me. It's hard to see, but
Yeah.
yeah, I read it all the time. It's,
So that's
it's,
my story, and I'm sticking to it.
and 40 books later, you've written GodTalk, which we'll get into. But Neale, I wanted to ask you. There are so many people, and I work full time in the mental health field. And everyone's in their own unique boat, but someone is experiencing some degree of turbulence during this time. How could people, repair their outlook on God and on life when it seems like, every bad thing possible is happening to them, and a lot of people just could inherit this, dystopian worldview, justifiably so. How could we, um, uh, give over what you experienced to other people? What does it take for the people to repair their relationship with God and to listen to God like you did? How is
Well,
that possible?
I think the first thing we have to do is admit to the possibility, that there even is a God.
Mm,
That's not a small thing.
mm,
So the first step in that process would be to acknowledge, yeah, I believe there is a God to talk to, that there is a supreme being or a higher power, whatever you want to call it, Allah, Brahman, Jehovah, whatever
mm,
word you want to use to describe the higher power. Then the second step in that process would be to realize that God actually does talk to human beings. And what's interesting is that people who do believe in God absolutely believe that God talks to human beings.
mm,
They believe that God talked to Moses. They believe
mm,
that God talked to Jesus. They believe that God communicated directly to Muhammad. They believe that God, routinely talked to human beings. So that's the second step. The third step would be um, to consider oneself worthy enough to be in that group, to be
mm,
in that category of people to whom God talks. So that we would have to acknowledge to ourselves that God doesn't just talk to the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury
mm.
or the chief ulama or the head rabbi or some saintly person like Jacob, but that God talks or that God talks to everybody all the time.
Right, right.
We're simply calling it something else. So that
Okay.
those are the early steps in the process. And I explain all of that in the book, God Talk, and I go into great detail about how that can occur in one's life. And then I go through three more steps in what I laid out as a six-step process by
Mm.
which we could all have the opportunity to experience our own conversation with God.
Now, you mentioned, and obviously it had a tremendous impact on my life and has reached millions throughout the planet. Why do you feel Conversations with God has had the impact that it has had? What
Well, because,
specifically?
you ever heard James Thurber? Ever heard that name, James
James,
Thurber?
I know James Taylor, but not
No,
James Thurber.
Well, James Thurber, you look him up on the internet.
Okay.
James Thurber was a playwright. And he talked about what he called everyman, capital E,
Mm,
everyman, and he wrote about every man's experience,
mm,
and he made the point in his plays, in his stage plays, that everybody's having some version of the same experience. So the answer to your question, as I have come to understand it, is Jacob. I simply ask the same questions that everybody's asking.
mm,
What's going on? Why does it have to be this way? What have I done to deserve this kind of a life? Is there a
mm,
way to solve it? And then I launched off into, since I wound up having this extended conversation, I
mm,
wound up talking about sexuality, relationships, right livelihood, career, health, even got into things like diet, child raising,
right.
parenting. I just talked about everything there was to talk about, and I think that when people began to read those books, they thought, wow, this guy's asking every man's question. He's
Mm,
asking the questions that we all want. And they found the answers,
mm,
at the very least, interesting, even if they didn't accept them completely or word for word or believe them. Nobody could say that the answers were not at least interesting. And what's true is that you write a book that's interesting and people will buy it and people will pass it on to others. So what happened was not only did the book sell well, but it wound up, they told us in New York anecdotally, that the book wound up being what they call a massive hand to hand book. That is, wives would read it and hand it to their husbands. Husbands would read it and hand it to their brother in law. Their brother in law would read it and hand it to his wife. His wife would read it and hand it to her best friend. And it was being handed around. So not only were, frankly, and not bragging, just saying, not only were millions sold, but multi millions of people were reading it. So they tell us that 15 or I'm sorry, 5 or 6 million people bought the book, but probably 15 million people have actually read it. Three
wow.
persons, 3 or 5 people for every book that's sold. So it turned into a hand to hand bestseller. Most people who've read it once have recommended it to at least one other person and
Mm.
said to at least one other person, you really want to read this book. You're going to find it fascinating. Now, you haven't done that because I haven't sent you your check yet. But when I send the checks out to people, then they go ahead and recommend it to other people.
Yeah. I mean, at least for me, I think if you asked me why it was so impactful, and you could agree or disagree, was that it was empowering. I think the relationship with God was empowering. So much of, at least my experience, that come from a very religious kind of Orthodox Jewish background, where it's disempowering. You're not taught that the answers are within, and the God that is portrayed as a God that you want to run away far from.
Yeah, you
And
should have been a
it's
Catholic.
yeah, and it's all with it's a commonality within a lot of religion, where it's this chauvinistic, tyrannical, jealous, vengeful God.
I was
And
only partially joking when I said you should have been a Catholic. Let me just interrupt you to
yeah,
share with you
please.
an anecdote from my life.
Yeah.
When I was 9 years old, sir, my parents were Catholic, God bless them, and they sent me to a Catholic parochial school.
Mm,
So now I'm being taught by nuns, and I'm
mm,
in the third grade. In a Catholic parochial school, the parish priest came in once a week to teach the children what was called catechism. That is, the dogmas and the doctrines of the Catholic Church. So
mm,
he's coming in one weekend, one Wednesday, he comes into the class and talks to us about the difference between mortal sin and venial sin.
mm,
And mortal sin is a sin that God will not forgive unless it's forgiven in a confessional. You can go to confession and get a mortal sin forgiven. But if you die before you had the sin confessed and forgiven by a priest, you'd go straight to hell. No questions asked. It's a qualification for instant
mm,
hell. So I said, I'm raising, now I'm in the third grade, Jacob. I'm raising my hand. Father, can you give me an example of a mortal sin? He said, sure. Missing Mass on Sunday without a,
Jeez.
without a logical excuse. He said,
Mm,
if you have to work, fair enough. Or if you're taking care of a sick parent, okay. But if you just decide to go play a game of golf or
mm,
whatever, and you get hit by a car on Monday, you didn't get a chance to go to confession to confess that you missed Mass. On Tuesday, you'll be in hell for the
wow.
rest of eternity, burning in the fires of hell. This is what I'm told. I'm a 9-year-old kid.
Mm, wow.
And the priest is telling me, and what's interesting about it, as it happened, that particular Sunday, I did miss Mass. I
Mm,
was at Mass almost every week. I was an altar boy. I was serving at Mass,
wow.
but this particular Sunday, I went to play at the softball tournament at our playground because I was the right fielder for our team, and the guys on the team were saying, "Come on, you got to be there for it's the big game. It's the World Series of playgrounds."
Right.
So in Milwaukee, so okay, I thought, well, I'll do that instead of going to Mass. Wouldn't that be the week that this priest is telling me that you miss Mass, you go to hell,
Mm,
unless you can get to confession beforehand? Now you got to know, class is over, and I'm trying
mm,
to figure out how to get to confession.
mm,
They only had confessions once a week on
right.
Saturdays in my parish. So I'm waiting till Saturday, praying every night that I don't get hit by a car or some lightning doesn't strike me or whatever
Mm,
happens, that I can make it because I realize that if I
mm,
die before I confess my sin to a priest on
mm,
Saturday, I'm going straight to hell. You want to talk about being Jewish and not happy with the God they're talking about? Should have
mm.
been a Catholic.
Yeah. It's incredibly intense what we have to go through, and the anxiety, the trauma, and just how low we feel about ourselves. And that's one thing that I love about you and your story is, like I said, I used to listen to some of your tapes, the nights when I worked in the mountains of New Hampshire. And I can't find the video to this day, but I believe it was a video where you described your an out of body experience. And in one of the videos, it's the best video I've ever seen on YouTube, and I can't find it. But if you do, I'll send that check right back to you if you send one at any time. But you discussed, um, when you encountered God, you received a message, and that message was, "You are perfect just as you are,
Just
and I
as
am
you are.
so pleased as you. And there's nothing that you could do that could, and stuff like that." And just hearing that, for myself was everything that I needed to hear. And I was sobbing each time I would play it again and again to that piece because truth rings true and it penetrates apart to your soul that God is unconditional love and it's not in judgment or wrath or indignation. It's in love. How could God abandon its seed, its creation? And that gave me everything. And I have to thank you for that gift. Literally each night I would play that before I'd go to bed and I would just sob because it was so true. It would and I think people need to hear that more. We're taught that if you have the checklist and check off every box of the list, you'll be good in this life. And that leads to a midlife crisis, as we know. And I think the more people hear that you are perfect just as you are, and it sounds a little bit Mr. Rogers-esque, but it's so true. It's things that we need to hear and remember. And that is valid and true of the God that I met when I had my near-death experience 30 years ago as just a young infant as 3 years old. That God is love. And that's what I love about your message. And I think so many gravitated to you for that.
I think you're right, and I hope that the messages are accurate because if they're not, we're both going to hell. But
Oh,
you know what George Bernard Shaw said? He said, all the interesting people are there anyway.
yeah. We'll have fun. You could prank me there, and we'll mess around. But I I read something pretty cool. Not read, I heard. Just to kind of scale back. One of my again people that I really and gravitated to is the late Dr. Wayne Dyer, and
Oh, yeah, Wayne and I were
he's
friends.
he's one of my favorites. He came to me in many other ways, and I just interviewed Karen Noe, who has a very close relationship on the other side with Wayne. But Wayne would speak about the hour of the wolf, how he would wake up at around 3 o'clock in the morning and take dictations, in his books. And that was, you could say your brain is kind of in those in between stages. But you speak about 423, which is one day before the day I was born, 424, the same day as Shirley MacLaine and Barbara Streisand. But talk a little bit about 4:23 a.m. and that significance to you, and how people could find maybe their sacred moments to really tune into God, because
Gosh,
that
you know,
seemed to be a specific time.
yeah, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to
Mm.
that particular question, Jacob.
Yeah,
423 just happened to be the moment that I was born.
yeah,
But I wondered why. I began wondering after a while why most nights, somewhere between 4:15 and 4:30, usually around 4:23, 4:24 in the morning, I would be awakened with an urge to get back to the keyboard. After I stopped writing by hand. The first three books I wrote by hand actually on a yellow legal pad, but then I did move to
mm,
a keyboard. But the time never changed. It was always somewhere around 4:23 in the morning, and I kind of wondered about that for a while. Then, for whole different reason, I was getting um, a passport actually
mm,
to do some international traveling. I'd never had a passport before, so I went to the government to get a passport, and they needed my birth certificate or a copy of it, if you please. So I had to write to the county in which I was born, back up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And, I paid them their, what is $7 to get a copy of the birth certificate. And it came in the mail about a week and a half or so later. And I opened it up. Just out of curiosity, I'm reading my birth certificate. 423
wow,
was the moment that I was born. Neale Donald Walsch, born September 10th, 1943, 4:23 a.m. And my blood ran cold. I just went, "Oh my gosh!"
mm,
The moment that I was born. No wonder that time has been significant to me. It's the very moment that I moved into the earth plane, if you please, and became physical once again. So is there a sacred time, as you mentioned a minute ago, for everybody? Is it the moment of their birth or some other time that becomes sacred to them for some reason? There's no one size fits all answer to your question, but I think that at some level or another, we will ultimately move into some kind of a rhythm where, yes, a certain period of time begins to make sense. Just as an example, my daughter told me years ago that for whatever reason, maybe it was because it looked good on the clock or whatever, but every day at 3:33 in the afternoon, that's her time.
Right.
3:33 in the afternoon, whenever she's got had a brilliant idea or a great insight or whatever, she'd look at the clock real fast. Sure enough, 3:33. So she finally said to me, "I don't know about you, Dad, but my time is 3:33 in the afternoon."
Mm.
So but I don't have a one size fits all answer to your question.
I understand. It seems also like synchronicity, and just the order of things, but also the sense of humor, if you will. I'll give an example. I had my near-death experience on a ladder in a playground, going on a slide, and my name is Jacob, and it was just the
Jacob's
allegory
ladder.
of Jacob's ladder, a child in God's playground. And God works in a very brilliant, synchronistic way. And if you just take a step back, you could see the divine tapestry and how brilliant it is, as well as the just sense of humor and how you just can't make this stuff up. it's
Exactly.
it's too
Listen,
good to it's almost too good to be true.
yeah.
Um,
What's funny? I even said to God at one point in the dialogue, perhaps you read that in the book, where I
mm,
said to God, you know, a lot of this stuff just that you're telling me just seems too good to be true.
yeah, yeah.
And God said to me, sweetheart,
Mm,
if God can't be too good to be true, who can?
mm, wow, wow. And it's something that a lot of people are not used to. But I've heard you mention that it's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Our worldviews and its projection, how we see God, and God and how we see our life. So could you elaborate a little bit about how our beliefs in God could shape the current worldviews that we have and the lives that we live? How could that influence the other?
Of course, our beliefs create our behaviors. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
All of our beliefs create our behaviors. If I have a belief that I see better with my glasses on than
Mm,
with my glasses off, then I will see better when I put my glasses on because I think that I will. So we all know about the power of positive thinking, to say
yeah.
nothing of the power of negative thinking. So
Mm,
there's no question that what we believe to be true,
mm,
there's an old saying, you know, I'll believe it when I see it. But the
mm.
truth, how the world really works is, I'll see it when I believe it. It's exactly the backward.
Which is
So
what Wayne said. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So the answer to your question is
Mm,
that most people in the world, 8 out of 10 people in the world, by the way, surveys have shown, I'm not making this number up,
right.
sociologists have taken surveys that show that 8.5, numerically speaking,
Mm,
8.5 out of 10 people believe in a higher power.
mm,
So we have a huge, huge majority of people who believe in some kind of higher power. But
mm,
we can't seem to come to an agreement about the higher power.
mm,
But the largest number of people who believe in a higher power believe that God, if you call it God, Allah, Brahman, Jehovah, whatever word you want to use, believe that God is loving, for sure. God is the
mm.
source of love, but that God is also judgmental, condemning, and punishing.
Right.
And now you asked, what does that got to do? What does that have to do with the world?
Mm,
Most religions teach that we are well served when we seek to imitate God-like behaviors.
mm,
So, because we imagine that God is judgmental, condemning, and punishing, we've decided that it's okay for us to
mm,
be judgmental, condemning, and punishing with each other, which of course we are
mm,
throughout human society, country and country, religion and religion, races with other races, different economic groups, people with different sexual orientations, different political philosophies. We are incredibly judgmental, condemning, and, if you please, punishing
mm.
with those who don't agree with us and do things the way we think things should be done. And now, in this day and age, we are seeing a level of alienation that I've never seen before.
Divisiveness and polarization, and yeah.
Unbelievable, way beyond anything I experienced as a young man in
Mm,
my 20s and 30s. I never saw anything like it. But now, again, races, different economic groups, people of different sexual orientations, even people of different sexes. I mean, men and women. I mean, the alienation that I'm seeing, to say nothing of nation and other nations. And we've had armed conflict on this planet for all but 2% of recorded history.
Mm,
That's a historical fact. So
right.
so when you ask a question, you know, what do our beliefs about God have to do with our human situation on earth? My gosh, we are acting as we think that God acts. We're acting with each other the way we believe that God acts with us. Now, what's amazing. If we change our idea about God, I wrote about this in a book called The God Solution.
Mm,
And I said that the solution to humanity's problems is to dramatically alter humanity's definition of God itself. To be daring enough, and this is a
mm,
theologically daring statement, but to be daring enough to call God, to redefine God in two words: pure love. Now, when I say this in front of an audience, Jacob, somebody in the back of the room inevitably gets up and says, "Oh, Neil, come on. If I've been
mm.
listening to you for 20 minutes to tell me that the big revelation from Neil is that God is love, we all know that. Even though there are differences between religions, we all agree that God is love." I said, "Well, wait. You didn't hear what I said. I didn't say God is love. I said God is pure love."
Mm,
Now, my friend in the back of the room will say, "Okay, what's the difference?"
mm,
The difference is that pure love needs, expects, requires, and demands nothing in return.
mm, mm,
We can't even love the person on the pillow next to us that way,
mm,
much less the guy across the street, to say
mm.
nothing of the man around the world. But this is
So,
the way God loves us, in my understanding. It's because God needs nothing from us, any more than you would need anything from a 2-year-old child. And by the way, if you're not looking closely, we're all acting like 2-year-olds on this planet.
we're very infantile in our behaviors.
God
Yes.
needs nothing from us. God requires nothing from us, expects nothing from us, and demands nothing from us. Can we believe in a God like that? Because it violates what I'm talking about now, violates the doctrine of virtually every major religion on the earth, which teaches just the opposite, that you must meet God's requirements, that God does have expectations, that God needs us to worship Him. If you miss Mass on Sunday, you're going to hell,
Mm,
and that God has demands. We call them the Ten Commandments. I mean,
mm,
some religions call them the Ten Commandments. So, and when I asked God about that, I said, what about this business? What are the Ten Commandments? God said, "Neil, we are all one.
mm,
You are a creation of me. You are a part of me. Who would I command? Myself? And who would I punish if myself didn't keep my commandments? Would my right hand slap the left?
mm,
It violates any sense of clarity or logic. So, no, I have no demands, no expectations, no requirements, and I certainly have no needs. I am, in fact, the greatest power in the universe. I need nothing, least of all from an undeveloped cultural species like humanity.
mm. That was beautiful. Thank you for that. And I think it answers the question that you posed, decades ago, for what does it take? For what is a need for things to work out? And it's really, you know, tapping into God, that God is the solution, love is the solution.
And changing our definition of God because that's the basis of humanity's behavior with each other. We use it as our justification.
Yeah. It's
That's how
sad that
that's what justifies, for instance, the death penalty. We really think that it makes sense to kill people as a response to the
we
fact
have
that they
to.
have killed other people. Even though Einstein said, Professor Albert Einstein said 40 years ago, you can't solve any problem using the same energy that created it.
Right.
You're not going to bring an end to killing by killing people who kill other people. So, but we fail to see the contradiction. We don't even see the contradiction because because, and this answers your question of a minute ago. We don't see the contradiction because we believe that God said, "An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth."
Right.
Justice demands that you kill people who kill other people. We'll show them, and all we're showing them is that we're using the same behavior on them that they used on other people. Only we say we're justified because we do it in the name of justice.
Mm.
And that's how we justify God's punishment of us, whether you're Catholic, Jewish, or belong to any other religion, you know, Muslim, or name a religion. Most of the world's major religions talk about a God who punishes, and we justify it in the name of heavenly justice.
It's amazing because it seems like the biggest issue is stubbornness and people viewing God through this box. And if you look at the planet that we're living on, it was once seen as flat. And through daring explorations, people challenged that worldview, expanded that. And I'm not talking about the flat earthers, though those don't count, but majority of us, we do believe that that is not the case. And I think for people, they are so accustomed to ascribing to normal and that being a leaf in water is okay instead of remembering who you are and tapping into and generating your own current. I think that's the big flaw that's happened, as well as historical understanding that if we don't learn from our behavior on a macro level, we're not going to change it. Much like a client who comes to my office, if they don't understand the point of origin with pathology and have that awareness and motivation, they're not going to alter it. So the lack of awareness and stubbornness seems to be our big flaw.
You mentioned generating, you know, who you are. Most people don't even know who they are. I've
Yeah.
discovered that most people have gone their entire lives and never really asked themselves, I mean, in a serious, really serious way,
Mm,
who am I? But I did, because God invited me to. She said, Neale, who do you think you are? Repeating, of course, the question my father asked me from the time I was 9 till the time I was 19. Who the hell do you think you are, anyway? But it wasn't quite the same way when God asked it of me. Who are you? Do you think that you're this? I am my body? Or do you think that you're your mind? Or maybe a combination, fair enough, of your body and your mind? Is that who you think you are?
mm,
And God said, because if that's who you think you are, then you're mistaken.
mm,
You are a spiritual being, what some
mm,
people would call a soul, if you please. You're a spiritual entity having a body
mm.
and having a mind, but these are just pieces of equipment. This is not who you are. This is just a piece of equipment, a tool that you are using in this particular lifetime, in this particular incarnation, one of hundreds of incarnations you've already experienced, and one of many hundreds more that you will experience as your soul moves through its everlasting journey. So, who are you? You are an individuation of divinity. Now, when I say that, again, talk about my audiences. When I say this in front of an audience, somebody says, "Oh, Neale, you trying to tell us that we're God? Come on."
Mm.
And I say, "No, I said I didn't say you're God. I said you're an individuation of divinity. Your relationship to God is the same as the relationship of, say, a wave to the ocean.
Mm.
When the wave arises in the middle of the ocean, it doesn't separate from the ocean. It's not something other than the ocean. It's an arising of the ocean in individual form.
Wow.
And when that form, that beautiful, beautiful expression, that powerful expression is complete, the wave recedes back into the ocean whence it came, to
Mm.
arise again on another day in another way.
Wow.
And that's who you are. Now,
You unfold in a natural way.
most
Like,
people don't see themselves as that. So when I
mm,
say to people, you're an individuation of divinity,
mm,
they go, whoa, wait a minute, what are you trying to tell me? And then they have to get into, how would I demonstrate that? How would I experience that? How could I possibly step into that
mm,
definition of who I am? But we've had many teachers from the Jewish tradition, from the Muslim tradition, from the Catholic tradition, from the Hindu tradition, from the tradition of all of the world's, by the way, 4,223 religions as of today.
Wow.
But one of those teachers said, in a very simple way, if you want to know how to behave as if you were an individuation of divinity, simply bless, bless,
Mm,
bless your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you,
mm,
and do good to those who would do you evil. And when a man slaps you on the right cheek, turn and offer him your left.
mm.
And when a man asks you for your coat, offer him your shirt as well. And when a man demands that you walk 1 mile with him,
Mm.
go with him 20.
Wow. And this is the embodiment of God, it seems, and the God lens, and living from a life that's deeply connected to beauty, to service, to empathy. So I'm wondering, you mentioned there's a lot, and you have to be living under a rock right now to not notice what's going on. On a personal level, I'm wondering, how do you generate the hope and the faith past some of the pain? Because I find when you're connected, you could feel a lot of what's going on a deeper level for either spectrum. So how do you keep on generating the hope and the faith past the pain, and how could others do that when everything in front of us tells us that the world seems like it's having its demise? Like, how do you find a way to continue day in and day out with all the things that you see that are ungodlike?
By
How do
knowing
you
who,
persevere?
by knowing who I am, by knowing that I am in fact a spiritual entity, and that in that sense, and that I will have many, many lifetimes, by the way, and not all of them here on this planet. And by knowing, as I've been told directly by God in my
Mm,
conversations, that when I do the thing that we popularly call die, but of course nobody really dies, no such thing as death. So when I go to what is popularly known as the other side, that is when I return to the realm of the spiritual, I will, take an assessment, make an assessment of all that I experienced, and then I'll decide to return to the physical. But I can decide to return to this particular planet or to any other planet in the cosmos. I can.
mm,
I'm not required to return to the Earth. I can come back and be anywhere in the cosmos that I wish to experience my physical reality. And I have done that. In fact, I've had, and so have most of us. Most of us have experienced lives on other planets in other civilizations, and now we're here in this particular civilization. I recall one night, Jacob, a few years ago, I was on the back porch of our house. My darling and I were out there late at night. It was a beautiful, cloudless night in the summertime, middle of summer. Beautiful night. We were just lying out there on the back porch, enjoying a cloudless evening,
mm,
looking up at the stars. And then my wife looked at me and she said, "Sweetheart, there's a tear running down your face. What are you crying about?"
mm,
And I said, "I'm homesick.
mm.
I've been
Uh,
there before.
mm.
I've been there. And now I'm here. And you know what? When I leave here this particular lifetime, I think next incarnation, going back there."
Mm. Wow.
So
I've never heard you said that, and having a near-death experience, I get homesick all the time. So for people who may feel like that this is not their home, and it's not. Wayne would say this is a one-way ticket back home this life, and you were just here temporarily. Day in and day out, how could people find that embodiment of home? How could we cultivate that? Because that could lead to a lot of sadness and depression. And I've certainly experienced so much of that in my life. Like, what could you say?
my answer to your question is the same answer that God gave me when I asked her the exact same question. And she said, "Neale, it's really very simple. Whatever you would like to experience in your life, whatever it might be.
mm,
Deeper connection with God, more abundance, greater level of wisdom, an increase in your personal clarity, whatever it might be, really. More humor in your life, whatever you wish to experience in your life. Be the cause of someone else experiencing it in their life. In other words, she said, Neale, stop being a seeker. I know you think it's a great big deal to be a seeker. You can go say, I'm a spiritual seeker.
mm.
Stop being a seeker and be the source. Those are three words that I never forgot that God repeated to me more than once in my dialogue. He would say to me, Neale, be the source of
Mm.
whatever you wish to experience in your life. Be the source of it in the life of another. Do you want to feel closer to God and stay connected to God and feel greater hope about the future and all the rest that we're talking about here? Cause another to have those feelings because, Neale, what flows through you sticks to you for a
Wow.
very important reason. Neale, sweetheart, there's only one of us.
Mm. In other words, the beauty that we see in another or in God is not separate from ourselves. It is all a part. It's all within, and we have to stop putting things on pedestals or searching for things that we already have. I read that we could think that we're not that, but we cannot not be who we are, as you say. We are, this spark of divinity, and all the things that we're seeking for is within.
And all we have to do is, as we move through our life, give people back to themselves. I had a policeman give me a ticket a couple of years ago. I was coming out of a coffee shop. He put a ticket on my car. I was overparked. And I said, Officer, could I talk to you for a minute? He said, yeah. He thought I was going to give him a ration for putting a ticket on my car. I said, I just want to say something to you. He said, go ahead. I said, I'm totally aware that when you put that piece of silver metal on your chest, on your uniform every morning, that you're making a promise, a silent promise that if it need be, you'll stand between me and danger,
Mm,
even if it means risking your life to do so. I want you to know I'm aware of the promise you're making
mm,
that you'll be my protector and my helper in time of need. And I appreciate that more than I can tell you.
mm,
This guy walked up to me, picked up the ticket. He was going to tear it up. I said, no, 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 we're not tearing the ticket up. No, this was not quid pro quo. This was not tit for tat. But put
right.
the ticket back on my car. You were doing your job. I am overparked. Put the ticket back. I just wanted you to know that I see you. I see you.
Mm,
It's not just your wife when you walk out the door in the morning who worries about you and who sees the promise you're making. I see the promise you're making too. Then he walked up to me. This guy was about 57 or so. He
mm,
said, you know what, mister? I've been on this force for 29 years. No one has
mm,
ever said anything like that to me. You just made my whole career.
mm.
He turned around and he walked away. Jacob, use the moments of your life to give people back to themselves.
Mm,
That's
mm.
how you will experience who you really are. I could, of course, be wrong about all of this, but I don't think so.
That's a beautiful story, and I think it's what people need to get back to, because when we're deeply connected, we see the real person in front of us, not the divisiveness, not the separation, but the real person. I've had once an experience where there was a principle that I couldn't stand on a one level, but I decided to test out coming from a loving place and seeing this person from that loving place. And energetically, I just felt like I was floating in the air. And I looked at him and I said all these kind things about him that were true. The things that I was seeing, I was able to tap into. And he just was denying. And then eventually he started to cry, much like you. And so that to me is like living like God, looking at God through the God lens and seeing the beauty past some of the pain, in the surface and all the things that separate the real core. And as Wayne would say, to get an orange, you gotta squeeze out. To get orange juice, you gotta squeeze out an orange. And to get love, sometimes people need a little bit more squeezing, but it is there at the core of all things.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed being on the program with you, my friend.
I have. And Neale, just lastly, you have your 40th book, and I have no idea how you're able to do that, but that's another story. Can you talk a little bit about your new book, God Talk? Um, what is God Talk about?
I
How
was
does it
asked by
kind
a
of differ?
publisher. I had a publisher call me. Normally, an author writes a book and tries to find a publisher. In this case, my phone literally rang one day about 9 months ago, and it was a publishing house. And they said, "Would you be willing to write a book called whatever you can title it whatever you want, but we'd like the book to be about how people can have the experience that you've had?" Because the
Mm,
one question everyone asks when they hear about your book is, how can the average person have their own conversation with God? I said, yeah, I can write that kind of a book. So I did, and they're bringing it out. It's called God Talk,
mhm,
and it's about how people can have their own conversation with God. I offer them, as I mentioned earlier, a 6-step process, and I talk about the whole phenomena of the higher power which resides within all of us.
mm,
It's not something that's speaking to us from outside, but that we bring forth, we call forth from within those of us who have a desire to do so. And so the book is about that, and it offers also stories from other people because the publisher invited people. They literally went on the internet and said, if you feel that you've ever had a direct experience, I mean a direct experience, interactive experience
mm.
of God in your life, tell us your story. And they collected hundreds of stories. They chose the 7 or 8 most astonishing ones and put them as part 2 in the book to let
Oh,
people know that it wasn't just Neale Donald Walsch, but many people all over the world who've had interactive encounters with the divine. So it's a fascinating book called God Talk.
and people could purchase it right now on Amazon, right? It's available to purchase. God
I,
Talk,
I
I
think it
believe.
comes out on the 14th of November.
Oh, it's
And
it's coming out soon. So,
uh,
um, but how would you say God Talk separates itself from, some of the others? Would you say what's a different
well,
element to God
it's
Talk?
not a dialogue book, and it isn't a book that talks all about the principles of life. The book focuses tightly on how the average human being can be connected with the
Mm,
source of wisdom, clarity, understanding, and truth and love that resides deep within all of us. So the book is highly focused on that particular topic, and that's what makes it different from the other books that I've read.
yeah. Well, I certainly look forward to reading it. Now, Neil, we've spent a wonderful time together, and I know many of my viewers are going to continue to look back on this video and continue to listen to it. It's a lifetime honor. I know I once had an intuitive reading, and the intuitive said, when I was in my late teens, you have to read Conversations with God. There's something in you that's also in Neil, and there's a similarity to a degree of your path. And I think to some ways there is, and I think that's why you reach so many people, is you are so grounded, down to earth, humble, and just a servant, and someone who's had experienced a great deal of pain and anguish and has transformed it into a beautiful masterpiece in the life that you live and the reflection that you have. Neil, I couldn't thank you for your time, the impact that you've had on my life and so many others. You're a welcome guest at any point of time, and I'm sure many of my viewers will continually climb, Neil's ladder here and God's ladder and continue to ascend in their everyday life, to find grace and beauty. So thank you so much for your generous time and all your brilliant insights.
Thank you, Jacob. It's lovely to be here with you. Bye for now.
An honor. Thank you. Wow, that was a spectacular interview with Neale Donald Walsch. We learned really how we can incorporate God in our everyday life, how to listen to God, and the status of the world right now. How could we really generate the hope past some of the pain and really tap into a deeper channel within our lives? So I am incredibly humbled and honored to have Neale Donald Walsh on my channel. Love to have him back on. Thank you all for tuning into my channel and listening to my interview with Neale. We hope to see you back. Please stay tuned for next week's interview on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder podcast, and thank you all for tuning in.